My name is Phil. I learned that the moment someone threatens divorce as a manipulation tactic, the marriage is already over. You're just deciding whether to acknowledge it or not. I'd been married to Molly for 6 years when she handed me divorce papers with a smile, expecting me to beg. Instead, I signed them and walked out of a marriage that had been dying for longer than either of us wanted to admit. We met when I was 28 and she was 25. I was working as a registered nurse at a hospital in Minneapolis, and she was starting her career as a morning radio host at a local station. We'd met through mutual friends, then started talking, and discovered we had an easy connection. The early relationship had been genuinely good. We'd spend hours talking when our schedules allowed, difficult, given that Molly worked early mornings and I often worked overnight shifts, but we made it work. We would stay up together when our days off aligned, talking about everything and nothing. Building the foundation of friendship and attraction that good relationships need. We were a team in those early years, supported each other's career challenges, and celebrated each other's successes. We had that sense of partnership where you genuinely enjoy each other's company and want to build something together. We got married after dating for 2 years. It was a ceremony at a nice venue, a reception with family and friends, and a honeymoon in Costa Rica. Came back and settled into married life in a 2-bedroom apartment near downtown. The first few years of marriage were solid. My nursing schedule was demanding and irregular. Molly's radio show required her to wake up at 4 in the morning most days, so our time together required deliberate coordination. But we prioritized each other, made efforts to maintain connection despite the logistics. We'd have date nights when our schedules aligned. We'd cook dinner together on weekends, maintained physical and emotional intimacy, and had long-term plans to eventually buy a house and have kids once we were more financially stable. Around year 5, we had this subtle change in our relationship. At first, it's easy to dismiss as normal relationship evolution or the pressures of demanding careers. Molly has this weird attachment to her phone. Not unusual. She used social media extensively for her radio career, building her personal brand, engaging with listeners. But the phone use became serious. She'd be on her phone during meals while we watched TV together, in bed before sleeping, constantly texting or scrolling through Instagram or responding to messages. The physical affection between us decreased. She'd be less responsive when I tried to initiate intimacy, would seem distracted during conversations, would choose scrolling on her phone over engaging with me, even when we had rare time together. I noticed, but didn't act on it immediately. I tried to convince myself Molly was building her career, that social media engagement was part of her job, that I was being oversensitive about expected behavior. But as months passed, the distance became impossible to ignore. We went from feeling like partners to feeling like roommates who happened to share a bed. A parallel existence had replaced the emotional connection that had defined our early relationship. After about 6 months of this pattern, I decided to address it directly. I chose a quiet evening when we were both home, with no immediate work pressures and a relatively relaxed environment. I asked her gently if everything was okay, pointed out that she seemed constantly on her phone, that we weren't connecting the way we used to, and that I was feeling disconnected from her. Molly's response was immediate and defensive. She asked if I was trying to police her life, said she was an adult who could use her phone as much as she wanted, accused me of trying to be controlling and insecure. The reaction was so disproportionate to my gentle question that it confirmed something was wrong. But I backed off. Didn't want to push if Molly wasn't ready to talk. I hope she'll reflect and return to the conversation more constructively. She didn't. The distance continued. The phone use remained constant. The emotional withdrawal persisted. I tried trusting that she still loved me despite the growing distance. Tried believing that this was just a phase related to work stress or her career growth. That we'd eventually reconnect if I gave her space and time. But things didn't get better. They got worse. By about 8 months into this pattern, I decided I needed to understand what was actually happening. Whether my concerns were legitimate or whether I was being paranoid and controlling like Molly accused. So I started paying closer attention to observing patterns. When Molly was on her phone, what was she doing? How she'd react when messages came through. Whether she angled her screen away from me. All the signs were there once I knew to look for them. The way she'd smile at messages, then quickly compose her expression. How she'd take her phone to the bathroom with her. There were so many things I noticed. I needed to see her phone, not to violate her privacy for its own sake, but to confirm or disprove what I was increasingly suspecting. It took weeks to find an opportunity. Molly was protective of her phone, always had it on her or locked in her bag, and never left it unattended where I could access it. Then one evening, I came home from a 12-hour shift, exhausted and hungry. Molly was at the dining table with her laptop open, intensely focused on whatever she was working on. She barely looked up when I came in, just said she had a work deadline for a segment prep that needed to be finished that night, and couldn't break concentration to make dinner. Asked if I could use her phone to order food from our usual delivery app. She handed it to me without looking, still absorbed in her laptop work. I took the phone to the kitchen, ordered food from our favorite place. Then I looked back at the dining room. Molly was still completely engrossed in her work, with headphones on. I decided to open her messages quickly. I started with iMessage. Nothing particularly notable there. Work conversations, messages with her family, and regular exchanges with friends I knew. Then opened Instagram. She had thousands of followers from her radio work and was relatively well-known locally. Her direct messages were extensive. Scrolled through them quickly. Lots of messages from listeners, professional contacts, and friends. Then saw a conversation near the top that made my stomach drop. Messages with someone named a guy I've never heard of. The last message showed flirtatious content. Opened the whole conversation. What I found was worse than I'd expected. Months of messages. Daily conversations that were emotionally intimate and clearly flirtatious. He complimented her appearance. She responded with playful emojis and suggestive comments. References to jokes and shared experiences I knew nothing about. He'd call her beautiful, and he'd wish they could spend more time together. She'd say she was working on that. Not explicitly sexual, but deeply inappropriate for a married woman. Emotional affair territory at minimum. And this guy wasn't the only one. I scrolled through and found similar conversations with 2 other men, all following the same pattern: flirtation, emotional intimacy, her giving them attention and validation she wasn't giving me. I took screenshots quickly, sent them to my own email, deleted the screenshots from Molly's phone, returned to the main screen just as the food delivery notification came through. I went back to the dining room, told Molly food would be here in 20 minutes. She nodded absently, still focused on her laptop. I sat on the couch feeling numb, wanting to confront her immediately, but knew that doing it while she was stressed about work and I was exhausted from my shift wouldn't lead anywhere productive. So I waited until the next day. The following evening, I approached her when we were both home and relatively calm. No immediate work pressures, no exhaustion affecting judgment. I asked if we could talk. She agreed, seeming wary. I brought up the Instagram messages directly. Told her I'd seen her conversations. The content was inappropriate for a married woman. Letting her know I was hurt and confused about why she was having these emotionally intimate conversations with other men. Molly's face went from confusion to shock to anger in seconds. She erupted. Accused me of violating her privacy. Said I had no right to go through her phone without permission. Called me controlling and invasive. I stayed calm as I pointed out that she'd handed me her phone voluntarily. I'd seen the messages inadvertently, but once I'd seen them, I couldn't ignore them. She deflected completely. Said I was making a big deal out of nothing. That these were just friends. That I was jealous and insecure. I tried to explain that I wasn't against her having friends. The issue wasn't friendship, but the nature of the conversations. That she was giving these men emotional intimacy and attention she'd withdrawn from me. I told her the messages from the first guy, especially, crossed clear boundaries. That calling another man while married, discussing wanting to spend more time together, that wasn't friendship. That was an emotional affair. Molly scoffed. Said I was overthinking everything. That this guy I was talking about was like a brother to her. That their friendship was completely innocent. I asked how flirting in messages qualified as brotherly friendship. How telling him he was attractive, responding to his compliments with suggestive emojis, sharing intimate details about our marriage problems, how any of that was appropriate. She didn't answer. As she said, I was being ridiculous and walked away, calling me jealous and controlling as she left the room. That conversation ended without resolution. Molly shut down completely, wouldn't engage further. Over the next week, we avoided each other. I worked my nursing shifts, Molly did her radio show, and whatever else filled her time. We existed in the same apartment but barely spoke. The silence was heavy, but also clarifying. It gave me time to process everything, to understand that the distance I'd been feeling for months had a specific cause. Molly had been investing emotionally in other men while withdrawing from me. After a week of this cold distance, I decided to try one more time, to give our marriage a genuine chance by addressing the issue directly and asking for specific change. I approached her one evening, said we needed to talk about our marriage, that I couldn't continue living in this limbo. Told her I was willing to work on our relationship, to address whatever she felt was lacking from my side. But I needed her to cut off contact with these other men she'd been having inappropriate conversations with. That we couldn't rebuild our marriage while she was emotionally invested in someone else. Molly's expression hardened. She said she was tired of my insecurity, that she wasn't going to end friendships because I couldn't handle her having male friends. I tried to explain again that the issue wasn't male friends in general. It was specific men with whom she was having emotionally intimate, flirtatious conversations. Those relationships were threatening our marriage. She stood up abruptly, walked to her work bag near the door, pulled out a stack of papers, and placed them on the coffee table in front of me. Divorce papers, already filled out with our names and information. She looked at me with this expression that was part challenge, part smugness. Said if I couldn't accept her friendships, we might as well not be married. That she wasn't going to live under my control and jealousy. I stared at the papers and couldn't describe the feeling that washed over me. This was it, the moment of truth. Molly was using divorce as a threat, as leverage to get me to back down and accept behavior I knew was wrong. She was trying to force me to choose between my self-respect and my marriage. The choice was clearer than she'd expected. I picked up a pen from the side table, flipped through the papers to the signature lines, signed each one carefully and deliberately, then slid the papers back across the table to her, told her simply that if our marriage had come to this, to her threatening divorce rather than respecting basic boundaries, then there was nothing left to fix. The smile drained from Molly's face immediately. She started backtracking, said I'd misunderstood, that she didn't mean we were actually getting divorced, that she just wanted me to understand how serious she was about not ending her friendships. I cut her off gently, told her she'd wanted me to surrender my self-respect, to accept her having inappropriate emotional relationships with other men because she valued those relationships more than she valued our marriage. Said she'd gotten her answer, and I wasn't going to live like that. I stood up, took my car keys from a counter, walked toward the door. Molly was calling after me, saying we needed to talk, that I was overreacting, that the papers weren't even real. I left anyway, got in my car, and drove. I went to a coffee shop and sat there for hours, processing what had just happened, understanding that my marriage had effectively ended in that moment. When I finally went back to the apartment late that night, Molly was waiting up. She tried to explain that the divorce papers weren't legitimate, that she'd downloaded a template online, filled it out to make a point, hadn't actually filed anything. Said she just wanted to shock me into seeing how unreasonable I was being. It was meant to be a wake-up call, not an actual threat of divorce. I listened without responding, realized it didn't matter whether the papers were legally filed or just a printout from the internet. What mattered was that she thought threatening divorce was an appropriate way to manipulate me into accepting her emotional affairs, that she'd valued her inappropriate friendships over our marriage enough to use the nuclear option as leverage. The papers being fake didn't change what they revealed about how she saw me and our relationship. I told her I needed space, so I slept in the guest room that night. The next day, I called in to take a personal day from work. Made an appointment with a female divorce attorney, someone a colleague had recommended during his own divorce. I met with the attorney that afternoon, explained everything to her. The attorney was direct. She asked if there were children or significant shared assets. I explained we had no kids, jointly leased our apartment, had separate vehicles, shared some savings and retirement accounts, but nothing too complicated. She said we'd file, serve Molly, go through a mandatory waiting period and mediation, divide assets, and finalize everything within probably a year if it went smoothly. I authorized her to proceed. I wanted the marriage to be officially ended. Over the next few days, I started preparing to move out. Didn't want to live in the apartment with Molly while the divorce proceedings happened. The environment was too toxic, too full of failed history. I found a one-bedroom apartment available for immediate occupancy. Smaller, more expensive than splitting rent on our current place, but I needed my own space. I signed the lease and started packing my belongings. Molly watched this happen, growing increasingly panicked. She kept trying to initiate conversations about working things out. Said she'd cut off contact with the other guys if that's what I wanted. That we could go to counseling, fix our communication, and save the marriage. I told her it was too late. That threatening divorce had shown me she didn't value our marriage the way I did, and that I couldn't trust someone who'd use our relationships and as a manipulation tactic. She started crying. Said she realized she made a mistake as she reflected. That she'd been stupid and scared and hadn't meant any of her threats. I felt sympathy for her pain, but with no urge to fix it. Whatever love I'd felt had been buried under months of emotional distance, inappropriate relationships with other men, defensive anger when confronted, and finally the divorce threat. There was nothing left to salvage. Molly was served with actual divorce papers about 2 weeks after I'd signed her fake ones. My attorney handled the service through a professional process server. After being served, Molly started calling constantly, texting, leaving voicemails, saying we needed to talk, that the papers had been just a bluff, a stupid mistake, that she missed me, that she loved me and wanted to fix everything. I didn't respond other than to tell her to send all communication through my attorney, as my attorney instructed. The divorce process took over a year to finalize. Minnesota required a waiting period. We had to go through mediation to divide assets. Had to negotiate details even though we didn't have complicated holdings. Molly tried multiple times to use the proceedings as opportunities to talk about reconciliation. She would send messages through her attorney about meeting in person, about reconsidering the divorce. I declined every attempt, maintained firm boundaries through my attorney, and focused on finalizing the legal dissolution as efficiently as possible. The asset division was relatively straightforward. We both worked, both had similar incomes, so no spousal support was required or requested. Split our joint savings 50-50, divided retirement account contributions made during marriage. I took my car, she took hers, divided household items through negotiation without significant conflict. The divorce was finalized about 14 months after I'd first consulted with a divorce attorney. I signed the final decree, mainly feeling relieved. The marriage that had started with genuine love and partnership had deteriorated into something unrecognizable. Ending it officially was closing a chapter that had been functionally over for much longer. During those 14 months of legal proceedings, I'd been rebuilding my life. The apartment I'd moved into became home. Started going to therapy to process everything. The betrayal, the manipulation, the loss of what I thought we had. My therapist helped me understand several things. Molly's behavior suggested someone who checked out of the marriage emotionally long before, but didn't want to be the one to end it officially. That by threatening divorce, but expecting me to refuse, she'd been trying to have it both ways. Freedom to pursue other connections while keeping me as security. The therapist also helped me see my own patterns, how I'd ignored warning signs for months because I'd wanted to trust her, how I tried to fix things by being understanding rather than setting firm boundaries earlier, and how I needed to develop better skills at recognizing manipulation and protecting myself. I started focusing more intentionally on my career, took a position at a different hospital with better hours and more stability, advanced my nursing credentials through additional certifications, building professional relationships, and finding work satisfaction that had been overshadowed by marital stress. Looking back now, over 2 years since I signed those divorce papers Molly handed me with a smile, I understand so much more clearly what happened. I learned that threatening divorce is emotional abuse. It's using the nuclear option as a manipulation to force compliance. Once someone does that, the relationship is fundamentally broken, regardless of whether they meant it or not. I learned that emotional affairs are still betrayals. Giving emotional intimacy, attention, and romantic energy to people outside your marriage violates the relationship, even if it never becomes physical. I learned that defensive anger, when confronted about legitimate concerns, is a red flag. Molly's immediate pivot to accusing me of being controlling when I'd raised reasonable questions about her inappropriate conversations was classic deflection from someone who knew they were wrong. I learned that someone's actions reveal their priorities more clearly than their words. Molly could say she loved me and valued our marriage all she wanted. Her actions, the emotional affairs, the phone obsession, the withdrawal, the manipulation, showed what she actually prioritized. Most importantly, I learned that self-respect requires action, that I couldn't preserve both my dignity and a marriage where I was being disrespected, that choosing myself over a broken relationship wasn't selfish, it was necessary. If I'd stayed, we would have fallen back into the same patterns. Molly would have been more careful about hiding her inappropriate friendships, and I would have been more anxious about monitoring her behavior. We'd have lived in distrust and resentment disguised as reconciliation. The divorce was the right choice. Painful, yes, but necessary for both of us to move forward. Molly needed to face the consequences of her choices rather than have me absorb the impact, while she remained unchanged. I needed to escape a situation where I was being manipulated and disrespected. I don't wish her harm. I hope she eventually learned from everything and built healthier relationships. But I'm grateful every day that I'm no longer in that marriage. No longer walking on eggshells around her phone use, wondering which male friends she's flirting with, and no longer accepting being treated as disposable while also being expected to remain committed. I wish to build a life that honors my worth, with a partner who respects boundaries and communicates honestly, with friends who support healthy choices, with work that's fulfilling and manageable. That's what I deserve and what everyone deserves. Molly handed me divorce papers with a smile, expecting me to beg and surrender my self-respect. Instead, I signed them and walked into a better life. That's not giving up. That's refusing to participate in my own diminishment. And I'd make the same choice again without hesitation. Because the moment someone uses divorce as a weapon rather than a last resort, they've already ended the marriage. You're just deciding whether to acknowledge reality or live in denial. I chose reality, chose myself. I chose freedom from manipulation. And I've never regretted it. Not for a single day.